On June 18, 2023, Stockton Rush, Hamish Harding, Paul-Henri Nargeolet, Shahzada, and Suleiman Dawood lost their lives in the now infamous Titan submersible implosion. Although there were plenty of warnings from experts, Stockton and his team at OceanGate chose to ignore those warnings, leading directly to the tragic outcome. But what fueled Stockton's mindset, and why did so many people buy into his assertion that safety cannot coexist alongside innovation? In this video, we'll be taking a look at the psychology behind Stockton Rush and the OceanGate disaster. Stockton Rush was born in March of 1962, and he came from a distinguished pedigree. His family was connected to two signers of the Declaration of Independence, and over generations, through investments in banking, shipping, and manufacturing, his family built substantial generational wealth. Although the presence of financial resources in a home in no way guarantees a psychologically healthy or physically safe environment, it's clear that Stockton benefited from his family's resources, especially when it came to his love for adventure. He was scuba diving before he was a teenager and was a licensed commercial pilot before he could drink a beer. Throughout the course of his life, Stockton's privileged upbringing allowed him to pursue his interests freely, and he turned to aerospace engineering as his first big venture. As told by Smithsonian Magazine in 2019, Rush traveled to the Mojave Desert in 2004 to watch the launch of Spaceship One, the first commercial craft sent into space. When Branson stood on its wing and declared that a new era of space tourism had arrived, Rush says, he abruptly lost interest. Quote, "I had this epiphany that this was not at all what I wanted to do. I didn't want to go up into space as a tourist. I wanted to be Captain Kirk on the Enterprise. I wanted to explore." After experiencing his first submarine ride in 2006, Stockton became fascinated with deep-sea exploration. He referred to this as deep disease. He wanted to get to increasingly further depths precisely because the territory was so uncharted. Being underwater seemed to evoke for him his childhood dreams of being Captain Kirk. The moment I went underwater, I was like, you can't describe this. When you go in a sub, things sound different, they look different. It's like you've gone to another planet. The fact that he sought out these intense experiences starting at such a young age suggests that Stockton was likely a sensation seeker. Sensation seeking is a psychological trait that reflects how likely a person is to seek out new and intense experiences. How much a person exhibits sensation-seeking behavior is determined about 50% by genetics and 50% by environment on average. Someone who is inherently higher on sensation-seeking would show the same adventurous spirit from a young age that Stockton did. His obsession with not only being an explorer, but also being a pioneer was strongly supported by his privileged environment. Many people dream of scuba diving. Very few are able to actually do it, especially before they're a teenager. So when Stockton realized his passion for deep-sea exploration, as well as the room for potential innovation, he mobilized quickly. In 2009, Stockton co-founded OceanGate with businessman Guillermo Sondline. According to Guillermo, building their own submersibles was not part of their original vision. Instead, they planned to acquire a fleet of submersibles to facilitate deep-sea tourism. Stockton wanted to do for deep-sea travel what his wealthy contemporaries were doing for space travel. He was particularly drawn to the idea of deep-sea travel to the Titanic. The Titanic tragedy has long captivated the hearts and minds of adventurers, and Stockton knew this firsthand. His wife's ancestors died in the disaster. He understood just how passionate people were about the Titanic and knew that they would pay to see it. One example of this passion is Renata Rojas, who appeared in the BBC documentary Take Me to Titanic and also participated in one of Titan's successful dives to the Titanic wreckage.
I wasn't sure how I was going to get to Titanic, but I knew I had to go. I'm not a millionaire. I've been saving money for a long, long time. I made a lot of sacrifices in my life to be able to go to Titanic. I don't have a car. I didn't get married yet. I don't have children. And all those decisions have all been because I wanted to go to Titanic.
Stockton had hoped that deep-sea tourism to the wreck of Titanic would be mutually beneficial for all. He would get to live out his childhood dreams. He would help other people realize their dreams. And he would be making contributions to science, all while funding more undersea innovation and exploration. As Stockton and Guillermo set out to realize their vision, it became clear that in order for their business to be viable, they would need to build their own submersibles. This pivot, which moved away from Guillermo's expertise in business and leaned more into Stockton's background in engineering, resulted in Guillermo stepping away from OceanGate, though he remained a minority investor. After Guillermo's departure in 2013, Stockton took over as CEO at OceanGate. And soon after, his goals for OceanGate became more ambitious. Now, not only was Stockton going to be the arbiter of deep-sea tourism for the world, he was also going to completely reinvent deep-sea exploration and maybe save the world. Stockton truly believed, and very well could have been correct, that the answers to many scientific questions lie at the bottom of the deep sea. And while Stockton had no shortage of big ideas, he at times seemed to lack the patience to execute these ideas thoroughly. It's not that Stockton lacked follow-through necessarily, it's more that he seemed to have an intolerance for delay, particularly delays due to things that he deemed uninteresting or unimportant. Given his privileged upbringing, it makes sense that Stockton might lack patience. Time was the only real finite resource in his world, and he was unwilling to waste it, especially when it came to realizing his vision. The fundamental issue was Stockton's vision was a bird's eye view of a forest, and it didn't matter to him if the trees were made of paper, because from his purview, he couldn't tell the difference. Although Stockton had earned a bachelor's degree in engineering from Princeton, his knowledge and experience really were in the areas of aerospace engineering and aviation. He did not have expertise in mechanical marine operations. He was not licensed or in any way certified to operate an underwater vehicle, nor did he have the adequate safety and emergency training needed to run a deep-sea tourism operation. However, because of his privilege, Stockton was able to bypass obstacles that might have been dream-ending for others. For example, when Stockton learned that it wouldn't be feasible for OceanGate to acquire a fleet of subs, he decided he would build them, despite his relative lack of training and first-hand experience. When describing a time during an early solo dive when Stockton had lost communication with the support crew on the mothership, he recalled it to Smithsonian Magazine as like being on the Starship Enterprise. There were these particles going by like stars. Every so often, a jellyfish would go whipping by. It was the childhood dream. This anecdote shows us that even in a time of fairly profound danger, Stockton was focused on adventure and exploration, not thinking in terms of safety or even his own self-preservation. In addition to lacking patience for delays, Stockton also lacked patience for those who disagreed with him, even if they possessed vastly more knowledge and experience. The most notable example of Stockton's intolerance for disagreement is what happened to David Lockridge, who served as OceanGate's Director of Marine Operations. David had been tasked with inspecting Titan's design, and he delivered a report in January 2018 that highlighted multiple safety issues, including visible flaws in the carbon fiber hull and a viewing window that was not rated for the Titanic dive depth. David reportedly had, quote, no confidence whatsoever, unquote, in how Titan was being built and feared rightfully that the hull could fail under stress. Stockton dismissed these warnings, fired David, and then took legal action against him when he continued to speak out. By taking legal action against David Lockridge after he raised safety concerns, Stockton demonstrated a willingness to use his substantial resources to silence dissenters, prioritizing the sanctity of his vision over these valid engineering concerns. Stockton's unwillingness to listen to experts and his bad faith interpretation of their warnings suggest that he truly believed that he knew better than they did. Although Stockton had led an extraordinary life, he seemed to mistake his privileged upbringing, love for adventure, and experience in aviation for a domain general understanding and mastery of the principles of physics in deep sea environments. The phenomenon of believing oneself to be more proficient in an area than they actually are is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. In the original paper by Dunning-Kruger, published in 1999, the authors looked at the discrepancy between people's perceived and actual competence. So someone would perform a task, and then they were asked to provide a rating of how well they think they did. Dunning-Kruger found that people who performed poorly at something tended to grossly overestimate their abilities, rating themselves far above the actual scores they got. In other words, people who are poor performers or lack knowledge in an area also seem to lack the self-awareness to recognize their lack of skill and knowledge. Dunning-Kruger posited that this gap between skill and awareness occurs as a result of a lack of metacognition, or your ability to think about and reflect on your own thinking. This pattern has been observed across many areas of expertise and really serves to highlight the importance of external feedback and self-reflection in bridging the gap between confidence and actual competence. Stockton's vision for OceanGate is a classic example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. He was woefully unaware of the gap that existed between his skills and knowledge and what actual competencies were needed to safely realize his vision. Importantly, people who demonstrate the Dunning-Kruger effect are not consciously aware of the gap between their skills and their confidence, meaning they're not being willfully deceptive. They genuinely are so novice that they don't know what they don't know. In the case of Stockton in marine mechanical operations, much of his knowledge came from his own self-exploration. He had very little in the way of actual formal training. This isn't to say that a person can't become an expert at something without formal training. However, the danger when one person designs their own education is that they're biased and they don't know what they don't know. People in this situation must make a conscious attempt to seek out dissenting perspectives and to consult with those who have more formal training with the goal of acquiring knowledge. When Stockton did this, he did it with the goal of being told he was right. In addition to falling prey to the Dunning-Kruger effect, Stockton may have also been influenced by a cognitive bias known as illusory superiority. This bias suggests that being close to greatness will foster the belief in someone that they too are destined for greatness. Stockton was certainly proximal to greatness, so he likely viewed himself as continuing that legacy. Whether it was Dunning-Kruger, illusory superiority, or some combination thereof, it's clear that concerns about safety were simply not given the appropriate level of attention that they should have been given. As Stockton was realizing his vision, his lack of patience and formal training, coupled with his immense privilege, created circumstances that were dangerous to himself and others. Was Stockton so focused on his own contributions and legacy that he didn't care who he harmed in the process? The available information suggests that this was most likely not the case. Stockton appeared to have a genuine, authentic desire to make others happy and to support them in achieving their dreams. Despite his great privilege, he seemed aware, at least on some level, that adventure and exploration should be accessible to everyone. Stockton had previously brought others' dreams to life and seemed to genuinely enjoy doing so. That joy, along with everything else we've talked about, likely fueled his decision to keep pushing forward even against expert warnings. This also helps us understand why so many people who knew Stockton have struggled to reconcile how someone who was not a cruel or violent person could have acted in a way that ultimately led to such a tragic outcome. Not everyone was simply rich or blinded by Stockton's wealth and promises. For example, Jay and Sean Bloom backed out of the tragic Titan dive after they began investigating the submersible's design more closely.
When the news initially broke, before the news initially broke, when we were considering actually going on the submarine ourselves, one of the safety concerns I had before getting on was literally about the structural integrity of the submarine. Ultimately, I ended up warning my dad about it, and he ended up agreeing with me, and when we tried to ask Stockton questions, he kind of brush it off a little bit.
He has a different risk appetite than I do. I'm a pilot. I have my helicopter pilot's license. I wouldn't get into an experimental aircraft.
Jay and Sean Bloom didn't seem to share the intense passion for Titanic that some did, which may have helped them avoid tragedy. As we touched on earlier, many passengers were driven by a deep, almost obsessive passion for the Titanic disaster. This kind of passion can make a person more susceptible to cognitive biases that affect their decision-making. To Renata Rojas, Stockton was almost godlike. He was the person who finally made her lifelong dream come true. For this reason, she was primed to believe whatever he said, even when it contradicted experts, a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. Another potential cognitive bias at play for OceanGate's passengers was the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy occurs when someone is resistant to changing a plan or course of action because of the time or finances they've already invested into it. For example, Renata had already dedicated decades of her life to achieving her goal of reaching Titanic. Turning back when she had come so far and was so close, despite the risks, could have felt intolerable psychologically because she'd already invested so much and sacrificed so much. Beyond these biases, the apparent legitimacy of Stockton's operation also fostered a sense of trust. The fact that others were willing to put their necks on the line for his vision suggested to many that he was onto something worthwhile. Stockton was also a charismatic, wealthy white man, traits that our society too often treats as hallmarks of legitimacy, even in the absence of other confirming information. OceanGate missions also projected an air of credibility. On board were PhD-level biologists, a medical doctor, a chef. OceanGate was a huge operation. Together, these factors likely created a powerful halo effect around Stockton and further cemented his belief that he was a man destined for greatness. In the years since the tragedy, Stockton has mostly been painted as a villain, especially by those who didn't know him personally, though even some who did, like David Lockridge, have echoed this view. And that is the big question. Was Stockton Rush knowingly putting others' lives at risk for profit? Or was he a visionary who believed so strongly in his dream that he was blind to the dangers? The right answer to that question will depend on who you ask, because both things are true if you consider the impact of his actions. If we look at the data and try to disentangle his impact from his intention, it seems that in all likelihood, Stockton's motivations were likely a mix of self-centered, namely those around his own legacy, and pro-social. He wanted to do good things and he wanted to make the world a better place. However, problems arose when Stockton's drive to innovate outpaced all other concerns. Stockton's innate penchant for sensation-seeking, combined with his privilege and possible cognitive distortions, seemed to fuel his reckless behavior. He was so focused on his legacy and achieving the transformative greatness of his childhood idol, Captain Kirk, that it didn't matter that the forest he'd envisioned was made of paper trees. From his vantage point, it all looked real enough. The story of the Titan submersible tragedy teaches us an important lesson about privilege and how, with enough of it, it can distort someone's worldview to the point where they are a danger to themselves and those around them. Whether or not OceanGate will be held legally accountable for the tragedy remains to be seen. However, one thing we can be sure of is that this is not the outcome Stockton wanted. Nonetheless, it is the outcome he pursued unknowingly as a result of his curious wiring.